So I got a question for you today as we start, the one that you cannot answer, and I expect that Google's not going to give you the answer to this. I could change my glasses. These, by the way, are my real reading glasses, but sometimes the light gets in there. So these are the ones that I wear that have no reflection on. The reason for that is that actually there's it's, and I often forget that. I forget lots of things. I forget to turn on the mic. I forget to send out the email that I send out to some friends. I do a lot of things. But this is something I had to look up. 21 years and 29 days ago, a historical event occurred. Can you guess what it is? Now, if I don't forget, I'll come back and tell you what it was by the time I get done. But I don't have anybody here to remind me. So if it was live, and I'm live right now, obviously, this is me, though. This is not the artificial intelligence me. Well, there's some artificial intelligence in there, but I digress. I don't have anybody here in the room to say, hey, wait a minute, you didn't tell us that. Now, if I make a promise like that on in a live event, somebody will say, excuse me, but you didn't finish the thing. So I need somebody on the other side of this camera to help me, but I don't have anybody. However, this broadcast goes out to the whole world. It's available. Very few will see it, but it will also outlive me. I know that. My best before date was a long time ago, and the days ahead of me are far fewer than the days behind me. But the cumulative effect of all of the days behind me are what gets me to here. And I was telling somebody this past week that if I had my life to live over again, I'd probably walk exactly the same path except for all the sin. And I'm pleased with the way God has led me. And I hope that what I've accumulated passing on through this means might stay alive in your heart, in your mind, but more importantly, in your feet, in your mouth, and in your behavior. And that perhaps somebody else will pick it up. We've looked back over these last several weeks, actually it's over a year and a half, at some old stuff. And we're going to continue today to look at some old stuff. But it's important for us to understand that since that event that started 21 years and 29 days ago, the proportion in the United States, it's even bigger in Canada, of people who were religious, nothing in particular, atheist, agnostic, didn't take a stand, didn't disbelieve in God, but just didn't commit to any kind of an organized way of thinking, or, as people often say, organized religion. As soon as they say that, you know what that means. There's no such thing as an unorganized religion, but that's a different story. Anyway, back in that day, roughly speaking, and stats don't mean a whole lot because every individual was just one person. But the people that you knew, if you were alive back in 2000 and whatever that was, 5, were about 16% were religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S. Today, that percentage has grown to somewhere in the neighborhood of 29%. In very round terms, it's doubled. That is the people who say, I don't have any religion. So what I'm going to point to and give you the answer to back at the end, if I remember to give you the answer. But then you can always email me and say, what was that happened back then? Since that time, an honest, sincere, well-funded event that had something to do with spreading the gospel, we have made so much impact that we've declined in our impact and increased the impact of people who don't take a stand in any particular religious fashion. We need to do something different. And I'm here to tell you exactly how. Now, I'm working on this consolidation of a lot of stuff from the past, a lot of stuff from the present, and a lot of stuff I believe going into the future that I'm putting into a book called The Ordinary Church Advantage. And today we're going to look at the spiritual decision process in connection with that. This book takes a look at history, and it also takes a look at why God has used uh, the ordinary churches. They tend to be the nondescript churches, not the famous churches, to win and reach as many people for the Lord as the big famous churches have. Now, there was research that's spotty on this. It used to be that I could say, hands down, small and new outperforms big and old in terms of its evangelistic impact. The more current research says it's evened up. The bigger churches are having a bigger advantage, which I would submit to you is not that they're getting better at it. It's just that the ordinary churches are getting worse at it because they have an attitude that says, woe is me. If only we had, and you fill in the blank. And I'm telling you that you have an advantage. You have all of the tools that you need, no matter how small or how big your church. They're all here. We're not going to talk about, the new way to deal with artificial intelligence. It will hit on the side of it. We're not going to talk about how to do social media advertising. Social media advertising proves itself to be of value, but much less value than some other things. But without question, the thing that has the greatest value is the human personality. So we're going to get there. How do we keep score on how the church is doing? What churches are successful? Well, the churches who are removing more people from hell to heaven, and every step along the way, not just a moment in time, but in growing people to the point, as what Paul says in Colossians, presenting every person mature in Christ. What leaders do we follow? Well, the leaders that are best to follow are not necessarily the superstars. If you're a superstar, you know a superstar, God bless you. I use everything that God's given you. But very ordinary, stumbling, regular people. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, not many mighty are called. And he says, I was with you in fear, stumbling, mumbling in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 at the beginning, but in the power of God. The power of God is still available in churches today. What limits do we accept on ourselves? We accept them and, well, nobody would be interested in what we've got to offer. Well, if that's true, change what you've got to offer. Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily mess with the message. There may be some adjustments in your messaging need to happen, but your methodology is the opportunity that we're missing. Now, today we're going back to a book that really changed me. Well, a professor who changed me. I took one course from him, by extension, James Engel, who was an expert. But he was an expert in consumer behavior science. He was a Christian who applied his art through this course, through Wheaton College at the time. And he teamed up with Norton, another guy, to write a book that was What's Gone Wrong with the Harvest. And now, in that book, Engel does something really astounding. And he started a thing that we're going to build out on a little bit more today, because I'm working on it. I'm always working on things. I'm not dead yet, so I've still got work to do. And he comes up with something that he called the spiritual decision process, and we're going to delve into that today. His point in this book, Norton and Engel, was our harvesting is really no good. We've lost all the blades on the harvester, and the harvest isn't happening in many places as it should. We're putting more emphasis on, well, if we only do this program, rather than better communication and relationships. It's not working, folks. Broadcasting your church service on YouTube or Facebook or one of the other platforms is meh. It might have a little impact, but it is not a sufficient tool to get the job done. What I'm broadcasting with you right now is not a sufficient tool to get the job done. It's not the only thing that I do. But every Thursday, I come here and I record something that's based on the research that I've done, that I am consolidating to pass on. And I believe this book that I'm going to publish for you The ordinary church advantage will shake you loose if you let it. We'll see. Uh, when you, and Engel got this right, and there's some things that he didn't get complete, but in good communications, you got to know who you're talking to. And you got to use vocabulary and means and methods for them. If it was working when I started the broadcast, there was some music in the background that I know you've never heard before because it was just released this past week. And it was created using modern tools, but it's a lyrics first music. I'm leaving the notes, the link to that on Spotify in the description below this video. If you get tired of the video, you can go and click and listen to that. But listen to the lyrics. Never mind the container, the music. It's got a country flair to it. And if you don't like country music, I don't like country music, but I'm with the lyrics. You see, what we've got going on in our world right now is Taylor Swift. It's very, very popular. In fact, 50% of Americans say they're Taylor Swift fans. I've heard some of her music, I guess, on the radio, and I've listened to some of it, and I will say, yeah, if I was into it, I'd probably be into it. But it's in Western civilization, 80 to 90% of our teenagers can quote you Taylor Swift lyrics. Now, the lyrics that are in the music that I'm recommending to you are all, they're not Bible quotes, but they are all spiritually focused based on the Christian message. And if this style doesn't suit your fancy, there are other styles. In fact, if you go and use the right tools, you can make your own music with your own lyrics, and you can do it without a live band and without a human voice. It's amazing what you can do. Music carries a message. I can still quote you the words to Blue Suede Shoes. On earth are blue suede shoes, Elvis? Oh, Elvis, do you remember that? Oh, he's gone a long time before, 21 years and 29 days ago. The container is always adapting in culture. But what has to happen is that the message needs to be put in the language that people understand. It's when you're doing good communication, you know your audience and you're speaking a language that they can understand. And so you're adapting your approach, not so much the content of the message, but you're adapting the way you're delivering it to meet them where they're at. And I just suggested music is something that you ought to be using. Not the songs we sing in church. They're not so bad, but songs that can reach them in a style that they listen to in their earbuds, because that's what they're doing. And then we got to look, after we do something, we got to see how did it work? Do before and after. If you want to get really sophisticated, you can do what we call A/B testing. Test it this way, measure it. Test it that way, measure it, and compare the two and go with A or B, whichever is the best. And then if you say A was best, then develop C and test C against A and see which works the best. And so if C works best, then stick with C and then develop D. We've got to constantly be moving because the world around us is moving. And we can't say, well, I like this or I like. It doesn't matter what you like. It matters what can communicate to the people in the world around you. And so you can learn. Back in the day of what's gone wrong with the harvest, they spend time on this, what I'd call a strategy time machine. Radio. Nobody listens to radio. People watch videos and listen to podcasts, and perhaps a minimal amount on the radio. Radio's not going to do it. Television, we can't afford it, but who needs television? I'm broadcasting for free. I don't need to have a big studio. I've got, I think it was $40, the webcam in front of me, and if I was really up to it, I'd change and I'd use the camera in this. The camera in these things are phenomenal value. Most people are going to watch this on this size of a screen in any case, not on a computer screen, so it doesn't really matter how good the resolution is. And even the words are not a machine like that, these words are barely readable. You turn up landscape and you sort of read it that way. Literature works that will always work. I got a long rant on why books are not going anywhere soon. But let me just say that when it's on page and it's literature, you get to go at your pace, not the communicator's pace. That's one of the key things that delves deep into the heart of people who pay attention. You just let your eyes go, like you have television on in the background. And I think people say, I read your book. And I said, well, what did you think of this? And it's the whole book is built around one sentence. And the guy said, what sentence? And he said he read the book. And he didn't even know the sentence. The whole book was written around. That was a pastor. He obviously wasn't really paying attention. Nice guy. I like him. He's still my friend. But he wasn't paying attention to what I said, which I think then was really good, and I think it's really good today. And I'll tell you what the sentence is if you ask. The spoken word, the human personality, we call it preaching, communication, is always going to be in vogue. But when Norton and Engel wrote that book, they couldn't imagine the internet. They couldn't imagine anything like the enhanced intelligence. But back in those days, there was a boom of interest through crusade evangelism, and we counted massive numbers. They were huge and they were strong, but they didn't stick. I was traveling with a pastor friend this past week who said that he was engaged in the bus ministry that was so popular back in the 1970s, and he noted what so many he noted. They could get the children, but they would, as soon as the kids went off to high school, middle school, they dropped out and they wouldn't come anymore on the bus. Well, the methodology was really good for children, but it wasn't good for getting into the homes of those children, reaching the whole family unit. You've got to pay attention to the whole family unit because that matters, and that's really difficult. In a world where the family may be immigrants is a large proportion of Canadians, much larger portion than US, are immigrants, and they start from the base of a different language, and the kids grow up in the school system here, and all kinds of dissonance between the old world and the new world that they have to face. But back in those days when we did crusades and spent gobs of money on church buses, the church numbers stayed flat, relatively speaking. They didn't grow as we'd wished that they would grow. Why does the harvest not grow? Because you have to plant, cultivate, water, and then you reap. You don't plant or sow in the same season that you reap. And isn't that a blinding flash of the obvious? So then why don't we have mechanisms to move from the planting? Well, we did it. We got the gospel out there and leave that to the Lord. The Lord never said leave it to him. He said, that verse is from Paul's speaking in 1 Corinthians. I planted, Apollos watered, and God gave the increase. It was all about what God did. Yes. But it was based on planting and watering. And we need to develop more watering or cultivating steps along the way if we expect the harvest to grow. For an individual, the journey to salvation is not a moment. It's a process. Now, you may jump in at a particular time frame in the process that you don't realize all of the ins and outs of what was going on in that person's life, where they say, I never heard that before. Can you help me find Jesus? And some people come to Christ really quickly. They realize that everything else they've tried is, the Old Testament says, broken cisterns. They tried, they filled it up, but the cisterns were broken. They wouldn't hold the water. The Engel scale developed, and that was the main contribution. That's why I pulled this book out. Engel's scale started us in a direction. Not enough people paid enough attention to it, but it started us in a direction, but it didn't get us to where we need to be It wasn't complete enough. It assumed that there was a residual Christianity in the culture. And there's less and less of that today. Witness what I said about the nuns. Um, it was very good. And he realized that there was more to be had. We had to get people to the place where they would zero on a scale, which we're going to cover, and where they're born again. And then we have to work with them after that. We're not even going to talk about the after that now. We got to meet people where they are. Someone a long way from Jesus, a long way from the ramp to the front of the church, needs something more basic, much more basic than we think, historically. And someone close needs to be encouraged towards a clear decision for their life. If you just have one approach for all people, you're not going to make it. And so next week, I think next week, we'll talk about the failure of the one-size-fits-all gospel. It worked, but one size will not fit all. We got to speak to where the person actually is. Back in that day, we counted decisions, not disciples. We said, look at how many have accepted Jesus, and then no data on how many people demonstrated behavior that indicates that they not only, was on the Great Commission terms, were made to disciples. And I struggle with the way people use the word discipleship because non-disciple and disciple. Once you're a disciple, what happens? Well, discipleship is not this. It's something else. It's maturity. It's growth and maturity because it starts with baptism, according to Jesus, and it moves on to obedience. And that's not discipleship. Disciple, that's what you do with a disciple. It's the person who wasn't a disciple became a disciple in the Great Commission. Then they went on a process of growing in Christ and maturity. We need a new word for that, I guess. We've got to develop our chops, our ability to work with people who are not in a ripe field. Now, there is always a ripened harvest. Jesus said there would be. There always is. But there are also harvests that need to take some time and grow. And the fields that are not yet ready, they need more cultivation. We need to learn to work with those, or we won't get to the place where there's a big harvest. We are harvesting fewer today because we cultivated too little yesterday. You get this big number up on the screen. Well, that's fine. It's not all bad, but it leaves the granary empty. So there's lots of things that we've got to do to know where people are at. We've got to hear them out. We got to listen to where they are, so we can't just go and do one-way communication with people. It's got to be, and we can listen between the lines to what they say to us and what they say to others. Study them and learn the meaning behind the words that you're using. And then we have to muscle our message into terms that they'll be more responsive to. We got more to say on it. And adapting the way we say things is not compromise. And the gospel presentations that we're used to having are still true, but you have to come at them in a different way. Now, I'm going to show you a grid. I'm going to talk about a scale, and I want to throw out a fair caution. This is not a way to pigeonhole people. This is a lens through which you can see people and understand. People loop around, they move forward, they move backward. It depends on where they're at in life. Typically, people move forward when they're in more of a crisis stage in their life. And sometimes they move backwards when they say of that crisis, God didn't treat me properly. I'm mad at God. I don't get it. They didn't pay attention to God all their lives, but now they're saying God's not treating me right when they didn't treat him right. And don't even want to enter into that discussion. Not much you can do except love those people. And we'll get to that. Now, Engel developed this scale. And this is not an exposition of the Engel scale. We will get to that in the book. This is just a preliminary introduction to it. He started by saying at -8 on the scale, moving from -8 all the way down through. People were aware of the Supreme Being. And we'll show you what's that I struggle with on that. Then we move to the first hearing of the gospel, which is not the time when most people move on down the scale. Then they have to learn the basics. They might hear it, but they won't stick. There have to be many repetitions of the message before people get it. And they have to come to an understanding of saying, oh, that applies to me. And it moves slowly for people, simply. And then when they say, that applies to me, but if I did that, I'd have to give up this, that, or the other thing. I like to use have always liked to use this illustration, peanut butter sandwiches. If somebody says, if I come to Jesus, do I have to give up eating peanuts and butter sandwiches? The answer is, yeah, probably you do. It's not the peanut butter sandwiches. It's the holding out against a full and complete putting your life in the hands of Jesus. And this is the concept of conviction book. We're going to cover that in depth. Recognizing their own personal need and then deciding, but they decide someday, deathbed confession kind of thing. Someday after I get all these things in place, then I think I'll probably decide to do that because I like the message. And then they actually repent, turn around, change their mind, and then they're reborn. That's a quick summary of the Engel scale. Now, Coleman didn't talk about that scale. Snyder didn't talk about that scale. Engel and Norton did talk about that scale, and they all put pieces together and recognized that what we're doing is not working. And their piece of it was very important, and there are other pieces, some that I'm not going to get to. For example, a great book published, I think, in 1961 by J.I. Packer was Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God, where it blended together this whole business of stuff that people would use the term reformed. I don't know what there was to reform. It's formed gospel. It's not reform. But again, I digress. So I think Engel's missed some things. I think that it starts at actually minus 12. And I have used this before, and so it overlays onto this. The idea that people just have no idea God talk is gobbledygook to them. It makes no sense to them. They pay no attention. That's where people start. God is not in their vocabulary except as a swear word. As you know, it's like the guy who said, I'm an atheist, thank God. And then they start to notice. What do they notice? They notice that thoughtful people truly believe in something. Now, they're seeing that in lots of world religions. They're seeing something. And I can appreciate the fact that yesterday I saw a thing from Muslim Relief company that's put together a big water tank with a pump on it that you can put on the back of a pickup truck to take into a forest fire area using existing equipment, not needing fire trucks. And I thought, good for them. I mean, if they see something and it's worth noticing, but you got to notice the fruit of it. You got to notice the whole thing. And the fastest growing religion going forward in North America is probably Islam, more because they have more children than we do, but also it's becoming an attractive message. It's not the gospel. It has no real power beyond sociological and psychological power. It has no true spiritual power. But they start to notice something. And then they start to think about it. There are 15 major world religions. I got another book that I'm working on that comes from history. 15 major ways in which people tried to put together an understanding of what is beyond this life. And they start to get to the place where well, I'm not sure, but I can't help but believe that death doesn't end at all. If we'll tell you death ends it all, but then so when they get to this -9, they say, yeah, but maybe not. And then they start to ponder. They've been oblivious up to now. They start to ponder, and they realize, well, answering that question of what is the purpose of life and what happens after that, these are questions that are worth thinking about, and that perhaps there are some answers. And then they run into a Christian someone or something is there on the other side, and they see something going on, and then and only then do they get to Engel's step 8. Uh, And now we move down to all the way through where people eventually they get to repentance and faith, and they're born again. And it's a process, and it's just a chart. You have to have a very loose focus on it, but understand that we need to understand that. And in addition to that, and I put these two things together in a grid. I don't know, how would you indicate a grid with your fingers? Where they're hostile. And then they might be, well, yeah, that's good for you, but not good for me. And they might say, well, I'm not sure, but that's not what I was taught. And they get guarded. And then they're saying that it just doesn't matter until somebody gets to them. And eventually a small percentage will show that they're curious and that they're ready to move forward with something. They're willing to kind of lean into the questions. And if you approach them properly and you date them often enough, they may find you attractive. You see, the worst possible thing is for a young man to jump too quickly at a young woman or vice versa. And no, if they don't get to the place where they say, will you give me your number, then they can't carry on a relationship. And it drives me crazy. People don't track that number, that relationship, and follow through on it. Because if they're attracted, you got to stay with them. You got to date them over and over and over again, and eventually the girl might fall in love with you. But it won't happen on the first date. Or if it is love at first sight, then that's the exception, not the rule. And it's the same thing with falling in love with Jesus. People might become your friend and not necessarily want to be friends with Jesus until they see a bunch of other people who are friends with Jesus who are just like you, and then they want to be friends with those friends of yours, and so on. And eventually you get to the place where they started back in the 1970s, believe it or not, with the seeker-sensitive thing. So we'll talk about that another time as to how that all evolved. It wasn't all bad. It just wasn't sufficient. Yeah. You put these things together, and I know you can't read this, but this will be in the book. This is a grid of all of those things up at the top of the chart. They're a little darker. Of the things that came before what Engel said, and the gold line is when people are born again. And it absolutely is a moment when you pass from death unto life, which isn't necessarily understood. And at each of these rungs along the ladder, going from -12 all the way down to getting to the place where the believers who multiply, and that is what Coleman talked about. Do you remember Coleman? So you put the two together, and you get a grid kind of like this. Let me get this thing off of my face. And you can take a guess at or evaluate. There's 133 different open cells here. These are not pigeonholes. These are just statements about the evolution of people. So any friend that you have who's preborn is in more or less one of these 133 cells. And the book's going to have all kinds of ways to approach these people and to help you know how direct you can be. The approach means, first of all, you got to be there. You got to fish where the fish are likely to be, and that's not in the four walls of the church. You got to be what the fish need to see. You got to fish where they're likely to be, but you also got to be what the fish need to see. They've got to see a change in your life where you don't have the same road rage as the guy beside you in the cart in the same circumstance. We get to the place where we proclaim the gospel, but we start with what they can hear, and that may be God with a lowercase g on it. We got to be patient and persistent with them, remember what they tell us, and move them slowly forward. And eventually we get to that which is essential, and that is persuasion. But you can't persuade somebody who's hostile or even detached. They've got to get to the place where they're warmed up for And so you got to learn the right timing. And that's what uh, ordinary church advantage is. This is personal. This works in every ordinary church. It doesn't matter whether the church is a large church or an ordinary church at the midline of 100 and fewer participants in the life of the church. You all have all of these advantages. And if you're a church leader, you have the advantage of being able to track where your people are better. Now, next time we're going to talk about one more thing, something I helped develop way back in the 1970s. And I think that's a way too arrogant of a title as I look back over it. A biblical blueprint for evangelism. It is a blueprint. And it's really quite useful. And we're going to go over many, many things in that next time, I promise you, next week. And it's going to be useful. Now, our problem was it was really outstanding where it was taken seriously. But it was kind of a wilderness experience. We couldn't get enough churches engaged in it. We didn't have sufficient funds back in the day, and it just ran gas. But we got outstanding results, and that's still true today because it took some of this attitudinal stuff that we're talking about here. We've gone far deeper today in developing it, because I've learned a lot over the last 50 years. But it's still we have a funding insufficiency in getting the message to people. I want to say there is hope for the future. I have a friend I went to Bible college with who pastored a very large church in a denomination that wasn't known for its gospel-centric approach. He did extremely well, and then it imploded, and I asked him once what he senses for the future. As I was doing research, and he said he had no hope for the church in the future. That so broke my heart. There is hope. Better engagement with people will bring a fuller harvest. Leaders who engage, what I'm talking about here, will benefit. It's worth your time. It's less than an hour. We're on lesson number 80. What's that? That's a year and a half. You can start from the beginning, and it will stir you, and it will reformat your internal SSD. We used to say hard drive, but now we say solid state drive. And you will find the joy in seeing people move towards the Savior. I promise you, by the time we're done with this series, you're going to have very practical, actionable things to do right here, right now, in your world, here in North America, perhaps in Australia, maybe in Europe. I am not speaking to the Asian world. I don't know enough about it. I'm not speaking to the South American world. We are going to get to some of the benefits of what was going on south of the equator, but small incremental shifts are going to bring real fruit. One final thing for you to think about. Whether or not your church growth depends on adherence, the people who are there now. That's where you're putting your focus 9 times out of 10 at least. Minus the people who are going to leave for various reasons, plus the people you acquire. So there's 3 A's there. Acquisition, adherence, and attrition. Acquisition isn't stronger than it. Attrition, your church is going to die. It is. It may not die when you're there, but it is going to die. So, adherence, pay attention. Who's in your church? I'm going to say your church is built of 2 people, by and large, with very few who don't fit into this category. They inherited a perspective. They grew up in a Christian family. In your church, they inherited something from their last church. They came there into your church from something that you didn't build. And then there is those who have adopted the perspective that you have of theology. They or their family or somebody around them had a friend who talked to them. They didn't get won by the media. They didn't get won by the Christian radio station. They didn't get won by the television program, and they won't get won by the internet. Won't get won by this. Some friend engaged them. That's the people that you have. So Attrition is going to happen. Who's going to stay here? Well, I don't know, but we know that some people are going to move. They're going to move away. They're going to fall away. Very little you can do about the attrition. You should do all you can in adherence so that you will minimize attrition, but very little to do once they've fallen away. And they're going to die off. And acquisition becomes the question. So, what are you going to do? Well, I want you to review the diagnostics, all of this, from the beginning of these series until now. But if you in particular want to know what's coming in the ordinary church advantage, the videos with the brown background, they're the ones you want to look at. And what are you going to do now? If you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten. We don't know exactly who said that. I think it was a guy by the name of Potter who said it first, but I've said it so many times. If you keep on going in the same direction, you won't change directions. So slowly and easily you can make a difference. So what? Well, do something. Do something different. It's a quote that is attributed to Einstein, but it's really his. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. It's a true statement, even if Einstein didn't. But every effective something must be available to every local church, every ordinary church, a church of 10, a church of 10,000. All of the methodologies that matter must be there because the gospel is always the same. And you can make a difference in your community if you make slow incremental changes, and I promise you that you can start by reviewing this data. It's not going to be easy because you've got to reformat the way you're thinking, and you've got to move some of your energy out of the adherence question. Not all of it. You've got to work on keeping the people you've gotten. If there's love in the house is going to stay full. And you've got to get people to understand what it means to love one another. So you've got to concentrate on that, and never mind the programming. The programming follows. If the programming isn't built out of love, it won't work. You've got to have this love where you care more about donating who you are and what you are to other people than anything mechanical. It's a process. You can make that process work for you. And next week, we're going to talk about spilling over. I'm kind of looking forward to going back into that binder. I haven't been into it since the 1970s when we published it. But I know that I've flipped through it and said, yeah, that's what we need to talk about. So we'll talk about that next week. And I'm asking you to do two things. Number one, pass this message on to somebody else. Please. We have no advertising budget. You want to donate money, then we'll advertise. But we have no advertising budget. But you are the advertising means. If this is worth hearing, pass it on to somebody and sit down with them and say, let's discuss this together. Let's see what we get from it. Let's see what we think. Carter is just wandering and not talking about anything relevant, and where he is talking about something relevant. And secondly, I want you to listen to that music. I left the link in the show notes there. And you listen to the lyrics. If you don't like the music, just set it aside. I happen to like the music myself. I just set that aside, and you'll be amazed at what you can do through just changing what you encourage people to listen to. It's amazing. There is hope for the future, but we've got to adapt and do something new, something old, but something special in our world. I'll catch you next week.